In many respects, the purpose of life is to discover who we really are. Thoughtful men and women realize that their character is a product of many people and experiences. We now know that DNA is not a fixed element, but is shaped and molded by our experiences and the experiences of those before us. In life, some individuals make decisions of such magnitude that they profoundly shape the faith of their descendants for generations. These noble and great ones were chosen before they were born to fulfill destinies that would significantly change the world and the people in it. One of these humble and valiant souls was Herbert Manwaring. This is his story. As an elderly man, he thoughtfully recorded his life experiences, the miracles, trials, and blessings that molded and shaped his character. A stalwart, humble man, Herbert's legacy is one of dedication, sacrifice, and diligent hard work. He was a man who kept the faith. He is our common ancestor, and it is from him that the faithfulness of hundreds of families grew.
From this point, I shall attempt to give the history from memory. It will be meagre and disconnected, as many years have passed before I conceived the idea that many of the events of our life's history would be lost if not written at the time. Now, in my 78th year, I am attempting to gather together the broken threads of my own biography. I am the oldest son of Henry Manwaring and Sarah Barber. I was born at Sandbach Heath, Cheshire, England, January 28, 1849. My father and mother lived a humble life. Father was a shoemaker, and mother ran a mangle and later bound shoe tops. In this way, they earned a very scant living. They did not have a home of their own, but lived with grandfather.
In his autobiography, Herbert recounts what he knew of his ancestral line and the generations before him.
I know but little of the Manwarings beyond my grandparents. It is evident, however, that they came from a noble line of ancestors. As far as we have been able to learn, Ranulphus Manwaring was a general in the army of William the Conqueror, with whom he came from Normandy in 1066. After they became established in England, the king gave him 15 lordship estates in Cheshire. He later became a wealthy, noted lord in that part of England. The Manwarings were in the king's service for many years. In fact, my grandfather states that his uncle owned a very valuable farm beyond the Brook silk factory at Sandbach, Cheshire, England. Grandfather worked on that farm himself.
The Manwarings had lived in and around Sandbach for hundreds of years, where Herbert's father Henry and his grandfather had worked and farmed. Henry's life experiences set the stage for some of Herbert's most critical choices. Henry Manwaring, Herbert's father, was born in 1827, the seventh of 12 children. This was the same year that Joseph Smith received the gold plates from the angel Moroni. Henry was 3 years old when the church was organized and 10 years old when the first Mormon missionaries arrived in England in 1837. Within a few short years after the missionaries' arrival, there were more Latter-day Saints in England than there were in Utah. During his teen years, he would have witnessed the missionary fervor that existed in England. At age 20, Henry met and courted 17-year-old Sarah Barber, and they became betrothed in 1848, and she gave birth to their first child, Herbert, on January 26, 1849. When Herbert was 6 years old, Henry began seriously investigating the church. His father's religious nature, commitment to searching doctrine, and conversion to the church made a deep impression on Herbert. In his autobiography, he described how his father obtained a sure witness of the restored gospel.
Father was of a religious turn of mind, and went from one religion to another trying to find the true gospel of Christ. He was a shoemaker, and worked for a time in a shop with a friend who was a member of the Latter-day Saint Church. He often went to hear the Mormon elders preach. For 6 years he studied the doctrines and principles of the various creeds of the day. He testified that he was in his garden one day, behind a hedge near his bees, praying for a more sure testimony, when he heard an audible voice telling him the Latter-day Saint Church was the true church. He had no more doubt, and was baptized right away, and remained true to the faith. He was baptized into the church about 1861, at the age of 34.
Sarah was baptized soon after. By the time Henry made the decision to be baptized, Herbert was 12. During the 6 years that Henry investigated the church, Herbert observed his father's religious study, and the family, no doubt, discussed religious topics together. Henry's extensive searching for the true Church of Christ made a deep impression on Herbert and prepared him to accept the gospel. Henry most likely taught the fundamental gospel principles to his family in the years prior to Herbert's baptism. Herbert gives this account of his own baptism at age 13, which occurred only 1 year after his father's baptism.
Having been taught the principles of the gospel, I was baptized in June of 1862 by Robert Bate, then president of the Sandbach branch, and was ordained a deacon about the middle of that month. The president of the branch later apostatized, and father was made president. There were only 2 families besides ours left in that branch. Father's sister, Eleanor, was the only close relative to come into the church. She did not live long after becoming a member. I do not know how old she was when she died, but she was only a young woman. She was unmarried and worked at the silk factory.
Life for young Herbert was difficult, and he accepted that reality with little complaint. As was the custom in poor families in England at the time, children were hired out as workers to provide their own room and board.
I have had but very little opportunity to go to school, and spent most of my boyhood days learning the shoemaker trade. As I did not like shoemaking, when I was 13, Father hired me out to work for Uncle John Barber, carrying off brick at a company brickyard. I did this all summer, but when winter came, I had to go back to the shoe trade. The following summer, I worked at the brickyard for a man by the name of Sam Mason. I had to walk 3 miles and back each day, besides doing the regular work of the day. Again, I had to return to shoemaking in the fall. When I was 15, I was hired by the year to a farmer by the name of Walker. He lived at Brindley Green. I got £1 sterling per year and my board. Mr. Walker had many well-to-do friends come to see him, and as I tended their horses and carriages, they often gave me a tip, so that I got another £1, which made me about $10 per year. The second year at the farm, I was able to plough and harrow in the field, and the boss gave me £2 per year.
During the 2 years that he worked at the farm, Herbert walked 4 miles to his family home every Sunday to attend church. For the 4 years since his baptism, and at the urging of the elders, the whole family had been trying to save enough money to send Herbert to Zion. Based on journals of the time, this amount would have been about $40, and this fare was only enough to get Herbert to Wyoming, Nebraska, the primary starting point for wagon trains to Salt Lake City. By early April of 1866, the Manwarings had saved enough for the $40 fare. They anticipated sending Herbert to America on the immigrant ship the John Bright, which was scheduled to leave at the end of the month. But there was still the problem of securing Herbert's release from his contract with the farmer. When Herbert approached his employer, Mr. Walker utterly refused to let Herbert out of his contract until the end of the year. At 17, Herbert was at a critical turning point in his life. In answer to his prayers, he received a profound spiritual witness that influenced him for the rest of his life.
On Sunday, April 22nd, I stated the facts of my circumstance in a testimony meeting of the saints, and had practically decided that I simply could not go. I wanted to prepare for my family to go to Zion, but the way seemed closed to me. After I sat down, Sister Nancy Bate got up and began to speak in tongues. She trembled under the power of the Spirit of God. After she had finished, Father, who was presiding at the meeting, asked if there were anyone who had the interpretation of this tongue. Sister Bate then got up and interpreted what she had just said. "Brother Herbert, thus saith the Lord, if you will be faithful, you shall go to the land of Zion. You shall have many trials and difficulties to meet, but if you remain faithful, you shall be the means of helping your father, mother, brothers, and sisters to that land. We had faith in this manifestation of the spirit of prophecy and began to prepare for its fulfillment.
This spiritual witness burned itself into Herbert's soul. He never forgot it and reflected on it often throughout the rest of his life. In the wake of this witness, Henry, Sarah, and Herbert formulated a new plan. On April 28th, Herbert obtained permission to leave the farm to get a haircut. All his possessions at the time fit into a small satchel, which he took with him. But instead of returning to the farm after his haircut, he went straight to his father's house.
Well, Mother, Father, and I held a council and concluded that I should run away from my place of employment, which I did on the 28th of April. I left my employer, went to town and got a haircut, then went to Father's and stayed overnight. I did not even visit my relatives to say goodbye, as I thought they might give me away. I said goodbye to those at home. Then Father and I walked 6 miles through by-lanes and fields, carrying a 60-pound trunk, till we arrived at Crewe, where we met a family who was going to New York on the same ship as I. As Father was acquainted with them, they being members of the branch of which Father was president, he placed me in their care, and we said goodbye to Father and boarded the train for Liverpool.
The 40-mile train ride from Crewe Station to Liverpool would have taken about 3 hours. Herbert undoubtedly traveled third class, which was little more than benches on a flatbed car. He left the train at Lime Street Station, which is still in use today, and walked another hour or so to the Liverpool docks. By evening, he boarded the ship, found his bunk, and prepared for departure the next morning.
This was a new and strange experience for me. I was only 17 years old and had never been over 15 miles from home. I had only one light blanket and a robe for a bed. The robe I laid on the boards of my bunk and put the blanket over me. I was alone, had no relatives, and only a slight acquaintance with 1 or 2 people on the ship. However, I soon made friends with a Welsh brother by the name of John Jones. His bunk was next to mine, and he became a true friend. Brigham Young Jr., president of the European missions, came on board and gave us a good talk before the boat sailed. When our boat was ready to sail, a small steam tug pulled us into the Irish Sea and out to open water. As the boat left, a group of Welsh boys sang a number of songs they had composed and cheered up the crowd with merriment.
The John Bright was one of the largest sailing ships used by the church. It was chartered 3 times to send LDS immigrants to New York City. This was the second of those 3 voyages. The ship measured 192 feet long and 25 feet wide and had 3 decks. The bottom deck was the cargo hold. Then came the 'tween deck, or steerage, where Herbert rode. The upper deck was for full fare passengers. On this particular voyage, there were 747 Mormon immigrants on board, including a 9-year-old boy traveling alone by the name of B.H. Roberts, who later became a prominent church historian and leader. The voyage to New York took 37 days, and although there was one severe storm, there were no deaths. The John Bright docked for a day in the New York City harbor, and the next day all passengers disembarked into a large building known as Castle Garden. This was the Immigrant Processing Center from 1855 to 1892. After 1892, immigrants were processed through Ellis Island. The passengers in Herbert's group arrived at Castle Garden about noon on June 7th. It took nearly 10 hours before they were processed, at which time they walked 2 miles to another dock and boarded a steamship. Once everyone was on board, the ship took off around midnight and sailed all night. They sailed out the East River and into Long Island Sound, docking the next morning at New Haven, Connecticut. Here they boarded a train which took them to Montreal, Canada, and from there rode trains through Quebec, Ontario, and Michigan until they reached Chicago. The trains were routed through Canada before heading west because the United States was engaged in a major reconstruction effort following the end of the Civil War. U.S. railroad companies took advantage of the reconstruction effort by increasing their fares. By using Canadian railroads, the church was able to avoid these extra costs. From Chicago, Herbert's group took another train across Illinois to Quincy, where they ferried across the Mississippi River. They then boarded a final train across Missouri to St. Joseph on the Missouri River. Here they waited for a night and a day in sweltering, humid heat. They then boarded a riverboat and sailed for 3 days and nights, about 140 miles, up the Missouri River to Wyoming, Nebraska. From 1850 to 1864, Mormon immigrant wagon trains departed from winter quarters, now known as Florence, Nebraska. But in later years, the surrounding city development there made it very difficult to stage large wagon trains. In 1864, with the advent of down and back wagon trains, the church's representative, Joseph A. Young, Brigham Young's nephew, moved the departure site 44 miles south to a tiny community named Wyoming, Nebraska. Here, there was a dock and little else, but there was a wide expanse of flatland that could be used to stage and organize wagon trains, horses, and oxen. This move south also cut 50 miles off the journey to Salt Lake. Down and back wagon trains were a solution created by Brigham Young after the disastrous Martin and Willie handcart experience of 1856. Under this program, each ward in Utah donated at least 2 wagons, complete with oxen and teamsters, plus several hundred pounds of supplies to travel east, down to Wyoming, Nebraska. There, they picked up Mormon immigrants and freight and traveled west, back to Salt Lake City. These down and back wagon trains were immensely successful in getting immigrant saints to the Salt Lake Valley at low cost to the church. Donations from the Utah Saints for these wagon trains were accepted as tithing. Teams and trains left Salt Lake as soon as the weather would allow, usually late April to early May, and then arrived at Wyoming, Nebraska by early July. Once loaded, the teams immediately returned to Salt Lake, arriving 3 months later, in September and October. Down and back wagon trains operated from 1861 to 1868, except during the years of 1865 and 1867, because the cost created too much financial drain on the funds needed to continue building the Salt Lake Temple. In 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, eliminating the need for wagon trains altogether. During the 6 years that the Down and Back program operated, it brought over 20,000 immigrants to the Salt Lake Valley. 10 wagon trains operated in 1866, departing from Wyoming, Nebraska between July 6th and August 8th. These wagon trains were nearly a mile long and were often in sight of one another. One historian observed that between 1861 and 1868, the Mormon wagon trail was a very busy two-way road for both LDS and non-LDS travelers. At any given time during the summer, there were several dozen wagon trains on the trail. Herbert arrived in Wyoming, Nebraska on June 19th, but his assigned wagon train did not arrive from Salt Lake until 4 weeks later. This gave him time to figure out how to pay his way to Salt Lake even though he had no money.
It took several weeks to load the wagons with merchandise, luggage, and the immigrant passengers. Of course, I had no one to give me any advice, or to help me get located. So I just wandered around the camp, watching the games and trying to get acquainted with some of the teamsters. One day a man by the name of Bill Stewart said he would like to have me for his clerk, and asked me if I would go along with him. He said he had the bacon wagon but no passengers. I anxiously accepted his offer, got my small trunk and luggage, and put them on his wagon. I found that he was from Pleasant Grove, and that he was with a whole group of Pleasant Grove boys. Theirs was an ox train, with James Chipman of American Fork as captain, and Apollos Driggs as assistant. These fellows were a fine bunch of young men, and I felt good over my prospect of getting to the valleys.
Herbert eased the workload of the teamsters by doing whatever work they couldn't do. When one teamster fell sick for 2 days, Herbert took over his team and drove it during that time. From then on, Herbert often drove teams, freeing the teamsters to hunt for deer, grouse, and antelope to feed the immigrants. Herbert's trip across the plains took 3 full months, with the wagon train arriving around September 15, 1866. The trip was largely uneventful and peaceful, even though they had multiple encounters with Indians and some trouble with livestock. In the 1850s, wagon trains arrived and stopped in Salt Lake at Washington Square, which is where the Salt Lake County building stands today. Sometime in the 1860s, the stopping point for wagon trains was moved to the tithing yards. The tithing yards were located on the northeast corner of Main Street and South Temple, where the Joseph Smith Memorial Building stands today.
Our wagon train was driven into the tithing yard at Salt Lake City, where the freight and luggage were unloaded. Passengers who had friends or relatives were taken to their homes, but those who were without relatives or acquaintances camped in the tithing yard until they could find some place to go. The Pleasant Grove boys took me with them. They left the same evening that we reached Salt Lake and camped for the night at the Milo Andrus Ranch about 15 miles south of the city. About 4 o'clock the next morning they started out for Pleasant Grove and arrived there about noon. That night there was a celebration and dance for the boys. I was made to feel at home with the parents of William Stewart. They provided me a bed on the ground of their orchard until I could hear from my father's cousin in Springville.
Herbert stayed that winter in Springville with a great-uncle on his father's side. But when spring came, he was anxious to find work that would help him finance his family's passage to Utah. He spent the spring and summer driving teams, working in the fields for Brigham Young, and building the City Creek Canyon Road. But as fall approached, he felt he had to hire himself to something more permanent for the winter. At the tithing yards, he learned of an Isaac Ferguson who was looking for farm help. Mr. Ferguson was a polygamist who had 2 farms with a wife on each one. One was in Big Cottonwood and the other in Park City. Herbert did a lot of work for Mr. Ferguson during the summer, but found him to be cruel to his animals and not honest in paying him. This was discouraging to Herbert, and he left Mr. Ferguson's employment in the spring of 1868. At about the same time, Herbert was rebaptized, suggesting that he was trying to reestablish his faith after his bad experience with Mr. Ferguson. Rebaptism was common in the church until 1897. Historically, members were rebaptized as an act of rededication. Herbert found another employer shortly after being rebaptized, a Mr. DeWitt C. Thompson, who had a farm in South Cottonwood. This good man and his wife treated Herbert fairly and almost like one of their own family. Herbert stayed on with Brother Thompson until he got married 8 years later. During 1869, there was a flurry of work being done on the railroad, connecting many LDS settlements to the main transcontinental line. The work was lucrative, and Brother Thompson often left with several teams to do railroad work, leaving Herbert in charge of running the farm. In June of 1870, during his second year working for Brother Thompson, Herbert had another life-changing experience in the form of a near-fatal accident.
On the 16th of June, I was cultivating potatoes. I was driving Mr. Thompson's cavalry horse, Major. A storm was threatening, and I said, "Thunder and lightning, Major, hurry up or we shall get caught in the storm." We had not gone far when a thunderbolt struck us both. The horse was killed instantly, and I was near to it. My clothes were torn entirely from me, and smelled like sulphur. My boots were blown off my feet, and were 15 feet away. There I lay, as naked as when I was born, and my face and breast badly burned by the lightning. A Dr. Harvey Harlinger was waiting on some sick children at the Thompson home at the time. He had just been to see them and had gone to the post office. On the way back, he met a Mr. John Tanner, who asked him to go with him to look at his crops. While they were talking, this shaft of lightning struck about 1/4 mile from them. The doctor was curious, and said he would go and see where the bolt hit. He walked to the edge of the meadow and climbed up on a pole fence to see if he could get a look at the spot where the lightning struck. He saw a horse lying in the middle of the potato field, so went over to see what it was. There he found me in my sorry plight. He felt my pulse, but could not detect that my heart was beating. He gave me a good shaking, and then tried to carry me, but I was so limp and heavy that he could not. He said that I flopped around like a dead fish. He lay me down and ran 1/4 mile to get Mr. Thompson. They brought a bucket of water, and the doctor began to dash it on my breast and face. Soon I began to gasp for breath. After they got me breathing, 2 other men came over, and the 4 carried me to the house on a quilt. When they were halfway to the house, they lay me down to rest themselves, and here, though I was not conscious, I spoke for the first time. I asked what they were doing with me. They told me that I'd been struck by lightning, and that they were taking me to the house. I could hear their voices, but could not see their faces. They lay me on the porch, as they thought it would be too crowded in the house. I asked them to take me in the house, as it seemed now that my limbs were dropping off. The doctor treated my chest burns with clothes wrung out of cold spring water to take out the fire, and then they administered to me, at which point I began to regain full consciousness. It must have been over half an hour before I regained consciousness after being struck. The doctor began to question me about the things I had seen on the other side. I said, I guess I did not get there. He said that I must have got pretty close, as he could not see or feel any signs of life until he had dashed the cold water on me. He then put on castor oil and flour to heal the burn, which was as large as my hand, all down my breast. It took 2 weeks to heal before I was able to get up out of bed. Many people came to see me and said they could not see how I could have been struck down like that and still recover. It seemed like I had been raised from the dead. The wounds completely healed and did not leave a scar. However, I was a frightful sight for a while and had partially lost my hearing. In fact, I've been somewhat deaf ever since. It took me a long time to get my strength back, but Mr. Thompson was very kind to me. He gave me light jobs and told me to be careful and not overwork.
Surely, during his long recuperation, Herbert thought a great deal about his precarious situation. He had been in Utah for over 4 years and had accumulated almost nothing to bring his family to Zion. And now he had nearly been killed. What would happen to his family if he died? But Herbert's fortune was about to change in significant and positive ways. Recognizing Herbert's weakened condition, the Thompsons put Herbert in school that winter. He did light chores while Brother Thompson went to Echo Canyon hauling freight from the main railroad line. This lucrative railroad work provided extra cash for Brother Thompson. So in April of 1871, knowing that Herbert was deeply concerned about getting his family to Utah, he signed Herbert for another year of work and then offered to advance him that year's payment of $150 to use as a deposit in persuading the church to bring the Manwaring family to Utah.
I then went to Brigham Young and told him that my parents and brothers and sisters were in England and wanted to come to Utah, and asked if he could assist me in bringing them over through the Perpetual Immigration Fund. I told him I had $150 toward paying their passage. He looked me full in the face and asked, "Young man, will you be responsible for the balance that will be due after they arrive?" When I said that I would, he told his clerk to take note of that and said, "They shall be sent for." The clerk took the name and address of my parents, and I gave him my $150. They were sent for. In fact, in the meantime, Grandfather Manwaring had died, and left father and mother a little money, so that they were prepared to leave when the word came that their ship was ready.
After his meeting with Brigham Young, he then had to wait 4 months for his family to arrive in Utah.
These were anxious days for me. I waited and dreamed of them, and many times it seemed that I was there counseling and advising them. It seemed that I was leading the children by the hand. Yes, I was with them in spirit all the way, day and night. Truly the prophecy of Sister Nancy Bate was being fulfilled. The Lord promised me through her that although I should have trials and troubles, if I would be faithful, I should be the means of bringing my parents and brothers and sisters to Zion. As I want to impress the import of this promise on those who may read this sketch, and especially my children and grandchildren, I shall repeat the words of Sister Bate, given in that strange tongue. "Brother Herbert, thus saith the Lord, if you remain faithful, you shall accomplish that thing." After 5 long and tedious years had passed, that prophecy had its fulfillment. A patriarch once told me that Satan had tried to take my life, that wonderful promise should not be fulfilled. That promise, and its fulfillment, has always been a great testimony to me, and I hope it shall be, to all my posterity.
When the family arrived in Utah, they were exhausted from the trip. Tragically, Herbert's younger sister Mary and also his father Henry contracted mountain fever upon their arrival in Salt Lake. Although Henry recovered, Mary's situation quickly deteriorated into pneumonia, and she died 2 weeks after their arrival at the tender age of 13 and a half. In their state of physical and financial exhaustion, they could not afford a funeral or a grave. She was buried in a potter's grave, and to this day, its location is unknown. What should have been an occasion of transcendent joy turned into one of grief and tragedy. After the family's arrival, George got a job at Teasdale's store, and he and Herbert supplied the family with food and other necessities. Herbert's family spent the winter in Salt Lake City, and then Herbert moved them to Springville the following spring. Henry and Sarah spent the rest of their days in Springville and are buried together in the Springville City Cemetery. In December 1871, Brother Thompson was called on a mission to New York City, where his family originated. During this time, Brother Thompson's oldest sons were ages 8, 4, and 2, so Herbert bore the primary responsibility for running the entire Thompson farm. He continued to work on the Thompson farm from 1872 to 1875 at a contract rate of $200 a year. When the farm work did not keep him busy enough, he hauled wool, timber, and ore from Big and Little Cottonwood canyons. Ore hauling was big business because South Cottonwood was considered the smelting center of the western United States in those years. Herbert was a gifted teamster and owned his own team of mules and a wagon. During the winters, Herbert continued to attend school and received coaching from Mrs. Thompson, who was known for her knowledge of words and definitions. Less than half a mile from the Thompson home lived a family by the name of Wilkins. The father of the family, Charles Wilkins, Jr., was one of the 4 men who helped carry Herbert to the house after he was hit by lightning. Charles' first wife had died during their trek across the plains in 1854. At that time, Charles had a baby daughter named Lillian, who was cared for during the rest of the trek by Job and Charlotte Welch and their 2 daughters, Honor and Uriah. By the time they arrived in the valley, the Wilkins and Welch families had grown very close. As soon as he got himself set up, Charles proposed to Uriah, and they were married. He was 27 and she was 14. Uriah gave birth to the first of 15 children on October 11, 1857. It was a baby girl whom they named Clarissa. By the time Herbert came to South Cottonwood in 1868, Clarissa was 11 years old. When Herbert was struck by lightning, Clarissa was about 14. Both families attended church at the South Cottonwood Chapel, located on 5600 South Vine Street. Herbert says he knew Charles Wilkins quite well, but did not know much about his family until, in 1875, he began noticing his oldest daughter, who was then 18 years old. About that time, he also staked a homestead claim on 160 acres of land west of the Jordan River in Granger and built a rough cabin on the property. Sometime during early 1876, as he completed the work on his homestead cabin, Herbert began to court Clarissa in earnest.
Clarissa accepted my proposal, and on the appointed day I hooked my little mules on the wagon, and Miss Wilkins and I drove to Salt Lake to get married. We were married in the old endowment house in Salt Lake by Elder Joseph F. Smith on Tuesday, May 23, 1876. On our return to Cottonwood, the folks gave us a reception and dance. Next day, we left for our new home over Jordan. We went out on the prairie to make our home without any neighbors to welcome us except a young fellow who was a cattle herder. We went 9 miles from her home with a span of mules and an old wagon, bedding, and some household utensils to a rough lumber house about 16 feet square, with about $125 worth of furniture waiting to be used. There were no neighbors within a mile of us. That's how we started life. Oh, she was a courageous little woman. I have never met one that I felt I could love better than her, and I will joy, I am sure, when we meet again, in that land where there is no more death or sickness to mar our happiness, where I can make good for many mistakes I have made, and we will have joy in meeting with our friends and relatives, and those we have helped to redeem.
Herbert moved his new wife and two of her little brothers into their cabin in late May 1876. For 3 or 4 years, they struggled to raise a crop on a dry farm with no irrigation. Herbert dug a surface well for their drinking water, but they had to drive their livestock 1.5 miles to the Jordan River every day. Around 1879, they finally got an irrigation source that enabled them to grow a small garden. It was another 5 years before canals were fully in place for Herbert to properly irrigate a field. So by 1884, Herbert was beginning to raise some real crops. His first crop was 3 acres of wheat kernels that were too poor to be milled. The second crop would have been good, but it was destroyed by a hailstorm before it could be harvested. By 1885, he started to have some decent harvests, but that only lasted for a few years. Then came more trials. Nearby settlers began irrigating their fields, and the accumulating runoff flowed onto and oversaturated his property.
When the men began irrigating above us, our land began to swamp and show saleratus. All of our crops and trees were killed, and the land became infested with foxtail and black tumbleweeds. This was a real calamity to us, and we were again thrown into poverty. We had to shift every way we could to make a living. It meant that we had to work wherever we could get a job. I worked on the Salt Lake Railroad, the Park City Road. I worked my team all I could, and then helped to lay ties until the deep snows of winter stopped the work. I also hauled salt to Park City and loaded back with coal.
After staking everything on his homestead claim and working for several years to develop it, his land was ruined. This trial must have really tested Herbert and Clarissa, but their testimonies seemed to remain intact. They realized that they simply could not farm the Granger homestead any longer, so Herbert set out to find another one. In 1887, he filed for a claim on a dry farm 5.5 miles further south. This would have been somewhere near 7500 South in West Jordan. He built another cabin on the property and moved 2 of his boys and a small flock of sheep there in April of 1888. Clarissa lost a baby boy named Charles Herbert in 1881 while living in Granger. He lived only 5 days. Of the 7 sons who lived, 6 of them were born in Granger. All of the sons, at very young ages, helped their father with the livestock and the farms. Because another family was contesting his West Jordan homestead claim, he had to leave 2 of his sons and some livestock there, while Clarissa and the youngest sons remained in Granger. Leaving his sons alone in West Jordan broke Herbert's heart, but he had no other option to preserve his land claims. By 1888, Herbert's legal claim to the West Jordan homestead was finalized, and he escaped the harassing neighbors who were trying to get his property. In addition to this legal victory, another baby boy, Horace, joined the family in August. But probably the most significant event of that summer occurred on May 31st. Church records show that Henry and Sarah had been through the endowment house to be endowed and sealed shortly after they arrived in Salt Lake City. But sealings of children to parents or endowments for the dead could not be performed in the endowment house. So it was essential that the whole family travel to the Logan Temple so that they could do the work for their deceased daughter Mary, and so that all the children could be sealed to their parents. This work was done in the Logan Temple from May 29th to May 31st, 1888. Herbert and his siblings were sealed to their parents on May 31st.
During the summer of 1888, my brother John was canvassing for a picture of the prophet Joseph Smith. When he reached Logan, he went to the temple. Here he wept for joy, and prayed the Lord that he would so prosper him that he might be the means of bringing all his father's family to the temple for their endowments, sealings, and adoption. He was prospered, and sent for us all to come. He lent the money to those of us who could not pay our way. Our whole family rejoiced at this opportunity. I left my family under the stress of circumstances and went. I told my wife and children to trust in the Lord, and all would be well. We all reached Logan all right, and this was the first time the family had all been together since our sister Mary died. Father and mother received their endowments, were married for time and eternity, and had all their children sealed to them. We also began the work for our dead. This week in the temple was a bright spot in the history of my father's family. It was a blessing we had long hoped and prayed for. Personally, I have looked upon the trials of that summer as a test of our faith and integrity, and a preparation for the blessing of the temple.
How fortunate it was for John to have mobilized his family to finish their temple ceilings in 1888. By 1890, 2 of Herbert's siblings passed away. His brother George, the hymn writer, died in 1889 at the age of 35 from complications of pneumonia. His only living sister, Eleanor, died in 1890 at the age of 34. Also in 1890, John was called on a mission to the southern states. When he returned, he served in several bishoprics and participated in many miracles. He was ordained a stake patriarch in the Kolob stake and served in that capacity for 10 years before he died. With the deaths of 2 of his siblings and the constant struggle with water and irrigation on his properties, Herbert began to consider relocating his family closer to his parents. A sudden rise in land prices in the Salt Lake Valley made it profitable for him to sell his 2 properties. In early spring of 1890, he sold both his Granger homestead and the West Jordan Dry Farm. After paying all his debts, he still had $2,000 left to buy a new home. When he went to Springville for his sister Eleanor's funeral, he looked around for some property and purchased 30 prime acres in Mapleton for $1,500. He moved his family there in May. They rented a house until Herbert could construct another rough 2-room cabin with a granary and a shed. By fall, they were living on their property. Herbert and Clarissa lived on this land for the next 20 years, and since their oldest son Hiram was only 13 when they made this move, all their sons spent most of their growing up years in Mapleton. All of them except David found and married girls from the Springville-Mapleton area. A few years after their move to Mapleton, Clarissa became seriously ill. The illness was never identified, but Herbert indicates that they were afraid she would pass away. She returned to fair health after several priesthood administrations, but never fully regained the health she had before the illness. This illness also affected her hearing, and like Herbert, she was partially deaf afterward. With both of them suffering from hearing loss, it was inconvenient and sometimes laughable. One morning, as they knelt for family prayer, Herbert asked his wife to pray. She began praying in a low, soft tone, and Herbert did not hear her. So rather than repeat his request, he began praying himself. Clarissa finished her prayer, got up, and looked around. The boys pointed to their father praying, so she knelt back down again. When Herbert finished the prayer and looked up, the boys were laughing. He was quite indignant until they explained what had happened, and then they all had a good laugh. Clarissa had been a very good cook and housekeeper. She generally baked bread every day, usually 8 loaves, to keep the men in her family fed. But Clarissa's health had been compromised sufficiently that she could no longer do all the housework. Herbert says they had to train their boys to take over that responsibility. Arthur relates that when he and his brother scrubbed the boards on the floor of their home, they divided them in half, and each cleaned half the boards. Unfortunately, there were 15 boards on the floor, and both refused to do more than their half, so there was usually a dirty streak down the middle of the center board. While they lived in Mapleton, Herbert was often called to administer to the sick, not just in his own family, but throughout the community. He was considered to have a special gift in that arena.
During the time I lived in Mapleton, I was active in the church. I labored with J.T. Williams as a ward teacher for 10 years. I was also assistant to him for 2 or 3 years in the Mapleton South Sunday School. During this time, I was ordained a 70 and then a high priest. My companion and I were often called upon to administer to the sick, and many miracles were performed under our hands. Many were healed, both among the neighbors and in my own family.
Clarissa's health returned sufficiently that she became pregnant one last time in the fall of 1895, and David Heber, their last son, was born in June 1896, the year before they built their brick house. Herbert and Clarissa's first 6 sons had come steadily every 2 or 3 years, but there were 8 years between Horace and David. After 7 boys in a row, there was a desperate hope that perhaps this last baby could be a girl. In his 70th year, David wrote these verses to illustrate how the family felt about this last and final birth. "'Twas 80 years and 10 ago, June 29th, they say, that I appeared upon the scene and saw the light of day. Well, 7 boys had come before, and Dad and Mom were sad. No girls had come to break the spell. Oh no, they never had. So after waiting 7 years, the folks took one more whirl. They hoped, they prayed, then prayed again, that it would be a girl. The house was all excitement, the midwife on the go. She said, I think it won't be long, oh, just an hour or so. A little girl, 'twas all that they could think. It couldn't be another boy. They'd throw him in the drink. At last the crucial moment came, that little girl to see. Good gosh, oh darn, of all the luck, 'twas only little me. The rough 2-room cabin would not have been very comfortable for Clarissa, who now had 7 boys and a husband to feed. So 7 years after they arrived in Mapleton, the whole family embarked on a major project to build a proper home. The project started in the spring of 1897 and ended that fall.
When my oldest boy was about 19, we decided to make a tremendous cooperative effort and build us a new home. We laid our plans and worked them out. Hiram worked the railroad and earned the cash for current expenses. Levi, with Walter and Arthur to help, made the adobes on our own place. Orson worked on a brickyard for the brick. I had general charge of the whole affair and traded a couple of cows for the lumber. By fall, we had a nice new brick house and were very proud of our effort and accomplishment. It was to us a real home.
The Herbert Manwaring family spent the next 13 years living in that home. Although the structure has been remodeled multiple times, the basic brick home that Herbert built is still standing, along with at least 10 acres of the original 30 that were purchased. The years between 1890 and 1910 were significant ones, as each of the Manwaring boys came of age, married, and began to establish their own families. Herbert wrote an interesting summary about each son's family.
My family consisted of 8 boys and no girls. One of them, Charles Herbert, only lived for a few days. The rest matured into adulthood. As we only had a small farm, and not a very productive one, our boys had to get out and hustle for themselves. The older boys worked away most of the time, but always had a home to come to when not employed. The younger boys helped me on the farm. My oldest boy, Hiram, took a man's job on the railroad before he was 16 years old, and rather set a pace that the other boys followed. He also became inspired to go to high school at the Brigham Young Academy, and I am thankful to say that all of my other boys followed him there. Every one of them attended the Brigham Young Academy. When Hiram was 21, he was called to go on a mission to Australia. In this, he began a new activity of missionary work in the family. Later, Orson went to the Central States and Arthur to England. When Hiram was called, there seemed no way of our raising the money for him to go. He was also so interested in school that we hardly knew whether he should discontinue his schooling and go. We couldn't decide what was best to do, so we went and asked the advice of my father. After he heard Hiram's story, he said, "Thee must go on the mission. Thee can go to school when thee comes back. The Lord will prepare the way for thee." This settled the question, and was always a key and testimony to us all. Hiram sent word to the church that if they would give him 6 months, he would be ready to go. 2 weeks after that, He was appointed foreman over the gang of men he worked with at the railroad, and his wages were doubled. He went and fulfilled a good mission. Then the other boys were called, and we knew what answer to give, and they too were successful in their missions. I am only sorry that all of my boys did not have the privilege of going. I am very proud that all of my sons married worthy women in the Salt Lake Temple. Hiram returned from his mission May 5, 1903, and married Bessie Bird on September 15, 1903. They moved to Provo to attend the Brigham Young Academy. They had 4 children: Hiram Lawrence, Lucille, Eugene, and Gladys. My second son, Levi, married Belle Whiting December 5, 1901, and they had 3 children: Earl, Lola, and Flora. Orson, my third son, left on his mission to the Central States on September 30, 1903, and returned on Christmas Eve, 1905. He married Jessie Whitney of Mapleton. They have 3 boys: Elwood, Leonard, and Fred. Walter, my fourth son, married Imogene Bird May 15, 1907. They have 5 children: Naoma, Florence, twins Leo and Leah, and Lenore. Walter worked for Gus Powell in Idaho. He sent money from there to help Orson on his mission. Walter helped me run the farm in 1907, and he and his wife lived in part of our house until 1909, when the boys started up to Idaho to get them a farm. My fifth son, Arthur, was called on a mission to England while he was courting Emma Teresa Holly. They decided to get married just before he left, in the Salt Lake Temple. Arthur visited our relatives in the old hometown in England, and also Mother's brother John in Manchester. Teresa clerked in a store while he was on that mission and helped me support him there. There were 6 babies born to them: Marie, Holly, Wanda, Basil, Rondo, and Lorraine. My 6th son, Horace, had 67 students in his graduating class at Mapleton School. 66 of them were girls. He married Ivy Lee on September 21, 1920, just 10 days before leaving to join his brothers on the Idaho farm. They had 5 children: Kelsey, Horace Edwin, Glenna, Evelyn, and Lois. My last son, David Heber, met Sarah Zeller Hart while attending school at Ricks College, and married her on June 19, 1918. They had 5 children: Helen, Beth, Vera, Blair, and Var.
In 1902, 5 years after moving into their brick home, Herbert's father, Henry, Father Manwaring, as they called him, passed away. Herbert's mother, Sarah, lived for the next 16 years in their small Springville home located just east of the present-day Springville Art Museum. Starting in 1908 and continuing through 1910, most of Herbert's sons, led initially by Orson, began searching for farmland to purchase in Idaho. In 1909, Orson negotiated the purchase of 2 parcels of land, one for 80 acres and another for 50 acres, in Groveland, Idaho, a tiny community a few miles northwest of Blackfoot. Orson needed $1,000 to close the deal, so Herbert borrowed $800 against his Mapleton farm, and Orson sold some mining stock he owned to procure the remaining $200. Orson persuaded Walter and his wife, who had been living with Herbert and Clarissa, to move to the Groveland property, while Orson himself continued to supply cash for the effort by working for the railroad at the Bingham copper mine. When Walter left for Groveland, Herbert sent him off with a pair of colts and a wagon, along with a harness, plow, and harrow. Arthur returned from his mission to England in December of 1909, and after working for a few months at the Bingham copper mine, he and Teresa moved to Groveland in April of 1910. At some point, another nearby parcel of 80 acres became available, and the boys purchased that also. A month later, Herbert decided to sell his Mapleton property and join his sons in Idaho. He sold the farm, paid all his debts, and with Orson's help, he got his livestock and equipment moved to Groveland. Horace and his wife were married in September of that same year and moved to Groveland 10 days later. David Herbert was only 14 years old at the time, so he moved with Herbert and Clarissa, but continued his studies at the Brigham Young Academy during the school year. Levi moved to a farm in nearby Blackfoot in 1913, and though he was only there for 5 years, Herbert, Clarissa, and 6 of their 7 living sons were all farming in the same area during that period. Hiram was completing his education at the Brigham Young Academy and would eventually accept a teaching position at Ricks College in Rexburg a few years later. By June of 1913, Clarissa's health began to fail again. Herbert took her to Utah to visit Springville and Mapleton, but the trip may have been hard on her. In June of that year, she suffered a stroke, paralyzing the right side of her body and making her bedridden for 6 weeks. Her strength returned somewhat over the weeks, but she was very frail and nearly deaf. At this point, Herbert was caring for Clarissa almost full-time. Clarissa received treatment from a medical doctor and an osteopath and improved slowly until February 8, 1914, when she appeared to have a second stroke. Herbert expected that Clarissa would not recover and sent for David and Hiram from Utah. By the time the boys arrived in Groveland, her health had improved, however. Although she recovered slowly after the second stroke, she was so weak that Herbert had to carry her almost everywhere they went. When she was feeling well, Herbert would put her in the buggy and take her outdoors. By this time, she was not only deaf, but nearly blind as well. She had a third relapse in August and continued declining until the 22nd of September. That evening, she asked to be raised up, and as Herbert and Horace began lifting her up and putting pillows behind her, she said, "Hold me tight in your arms and caress me, for I am going. I am going." She soon became unconscious and remained in that condition until the early morning of September 26th, when she slipped quietly to the other side. She was buried in the Groveland Cemetery. All of her sons, 5 of her brothers, and 2 of her sisters attended her funeral. The fall of 1914 was a painful one for Herbert. He had been caring for Clarissa for nearly 15 months. Her death seemed to change everything. One line in his autobiography poignantly reveals his sorrow.
After our mother died and our home was broken up, my youngest son, David, transferred from Brigham Young Academy and went to Rexburg.
Clearly, Herbert equated the existence of home with the presence of his wife. Now that she was gone, home would never be the same. During this difficult time, Herbert had to regain his footing and purpose. After enduring so many sacrifices and trials, this 65-year-old man of character had to regroup and reformulate his purpose. He never considered remarrying, but he did think often of his ancestral family and their need for sealing ordinances. He understood the doctrine that they needed him and he needed them. He began visiting and searching temples and temple records for family connections. Though he continued to spend his summers on the Groveland farm and with Hiram and David's families in Rexburg, he traveled to different temples in the fall and winter, searching temple records for ancestors. He visited the Logan, Manti, St. George, and Salt Lake temples. He also visited the Spring City Endowment House because he discovered that the original settler of Spring City was married to a woman named Eliza Bridget Manwaring from Herefordshire, England. This woman had been a cook for Joseph Smith in Nauvoo and may have been the first Manwaring to join the church. On one of these temple trips, near Christmas time in 1916, Herbert went to the Manti Temple and the Spring City Endowment House researching genealogy. On his return, he visited his mother in Springville and then went to Provo to visit his brother Jesse, who was serving as the Provo Chief of Police. He planned to leave Jesse's house in the morning and go to Logan, but there was a major snowstorm and the train was blocked from running to Logan. While staying with Jesse, his brother John called from Springville asking him to return to help care for their mother Sarah. John was working 3 jobs and Sarah needed almost full-time care. Herbert agreed to return so that John could work. Shortly after he returned to Springville, he left Sarah for a few hours to help John dig a grave in frozen ground. While he was gone, Sarah fell and bruised her right knee and thigh, which was very painful for her. When he returned home, his brother Albert and his wife were at Sarah's bedside. Her pain was so great that she could not get out of bed. Herbert volunteered to stay and keep house and care for her as he had done with his wife Clarissa. He spent the next 17 months caring for his mother until she died in the fall of 1918. After caring for his paralyzed wife for 15 months, he then cared for his bedridden mother for another 17 months. These actions manifested his profound love and respect for the two most important women in his life. His dedication to the women he loved was exceptional. Herbert continued visiting temples in the winter and working with his sons in the summer until his 82nd year. At that point, he felt it would be unwise to continue traveling. Arthur had purchased Herbert's home in Groveland, but Arthur and Teresa invited him to live with them during his final years. He lived to the age of 86. The final words of his autobiography, seen against the backdrop of his long and faithful life, have deep meaning to all his descendants.
My children were always very kind to me. The boys' wives were all very considerate of my comfort and happiness. This pleased me so very much, as I had no daughter of my own. No one could be kinder to their own father than these girls were to me. My grandchildren were also very nice to me, and I am very proud of my entire family. There are 8 sons and their wives, 31 grandchildren, and 1 great-grandchild, 47 in all. I feel to say, Father, thy will be done. Only give me the strength of body and mind to endure faithful to the end of my days, that I may be worthy of a place in the celestial kingdom. I do feel grateful for the wife and children that have been given to me, and to know that if I shall remain faithful to the end of my days, that they are mine for time and eternity. I do feel grateful for the blessings of the gospel that have been confirmed upon us through obedience to its mediator, and hope that we may continue in the faith as a family, that we may not forfeit any of these blessings promised us, for they are worth more to us than all the wealth of the world. For what doth it profit us, if we gain the wealth of the world, and lose our own souls?
Herbert passed away quietly on Saturday, February 29, 1936, at the age of 87 in Groveland, Idaho. He was never bedfast, yet he seemed to know he was going to die that day. He called his daughter-in-law, Teresa, and said,
"Thank you for all your kindness to me. Tell my boys to always keep the faith."
He was buried next to his beloved Clarissa in the Groveland Cemetery on Tuesday, March 3, 1936. The day after his funeral, this picture was taken showing his surviving brothers, Albert and John, and 22 of his descendants. Throughout his life, Herbert experienced disappointments, setbacks, financial difficulties, physical injuries, and spiritual tests, from his youth to old age. But in all things he moved forward in faith and obedience to the Lord, sacrificing for his family and the kingdom of God. His life reflected his dedication to the gospel of Jesus Christ and has indeed shaped the faith of generations. His life exemplified his counsel to always keep the faith. As Herbert's descendants, we now bear the responsibility of continuing in the faith of our fathers, that we may be an eternal covenant family. In Herbert's own words, "I hope we may continue in the faith as a family, that we may not forfeit any of the blessings promised us, for they are worth more to us than all the wealth of the world."